There have been a number of really good books recently out on Christian nationalism and on white supremacy, and Annie Laurie and I have read a number of them to interview authors on our shows. But I have to say that our next speaker's book is truly special. And for me, reading it, I read every single word. For me, it was a true page-turner. I'm sure many of you are going to feel the same way when you read this amazing book. Robert P. Jones is the founder and president of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts independent research about the intersection of religion, culture, and public policy. And at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we often refer to the excellent studies and research and graphs and information that the PRRI puts out. So look them up, Public Religion Research Institute. With a PhD in religion from Emory University, Robert Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for many publications, including The Atlantic, Time, Religion News Service, and other outlets. You may have seen Robert Jones on major national media commenting on religion. His books include The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Graumeyer Award in Religion, and the book White Too Long. Some of you know what that references to. White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. His newest book, just out this fall by Simon & Schuster, is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, in which he refocuses our attention on the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery, and he paints a broad historical canvas of white supremacy by focusing on, in this particular book, 3 very poignant and tragic episodes in American history. And the book ends with hope. He does offer a path to fixing our broken nation. So please welcome Robert P. Jones.
Right. Good afternoon. Oh, come on, you can do a little better than that. There you go. All right. I'm used to speaking in churches, so thank you for that. Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and to join. I was here this morning for the rich set of conversations that we've had and caught this afternoon panel as well. So I'm very honored to be in such great company, some friends, some people I'll hope to make new connections with, and especially this conversation about white Christian nationalism and its connections to our current political situation. A lot of the conversations have focused on the rise of the Christian right, particularly over the last 50 years or so, rightly so. I mean, that's kind of our perch and where we can see it most and most clearly in its most visible manifestation. But as you just heard, and kind of as the title of my book gives away, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I want to take you on a little bit longer trip back in time to kind of look at where this current manifestation really comes from. How deeply is it rooted in our national story? What does that look like? And why has some of this remained just under the surface of our collective historical consciousness? So I'm going to begin actually with a story. I'm going to kind of read from the opening of the book, because I think this sets the stage well for the broader canvas that I want to kind of paint a picture on today. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost outside of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade craft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin to make plans to escape north. The Hickman Party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children on board, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight, but also knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the craft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lowertown on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that the St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with its trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th. But they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people who had been held under armed guard all winter, following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman nor his companions, nor the Dakota people, would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River, that the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri in the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters in the stories of indigenous peoples populating the land for millennia? Or do we portage east and cross the larger waters connecting the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago. Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So I tell that story because it holds together two things that we often see separately if we know these stories at all, right? The story of European encounters with African Americans and Africans on the one hand, or the stories of European encounters with indigenous people. But we rarely see the interconnections between these two. And by keeping those things separately, we also rarely see clearly the thing that holds them together. And that is the European conquest, shored up by Christianity, that is really the kind of common link between the story of kind of how we got to the place that we are in today. So my talk today is about America's identity crisis, which I think is a fair way of putting it. You heard Sam, put up this question. We've asked questions like this too at PRI, where you really think, I can't believe as a social scientist, I am writing a question about Satan worshiping pedophiles, right? That this is something people are actually believing is happening in the country, and that we get upwards of 25 to 30% of the country saying, yeah, that's happening in the country. But yet here we are, right? The whole vaccination kind of craziness that we had in the country. So I think this, identity crisis, I think the other way of putting it was something that James Baldwin, I think, said so clearly that's kind of stayed with me. He was asking about how he and many other African Americans in an interview when he was still alive saw white Americans. And he ended up saying this kind of very telling phrase. He said, well, we do know them pretty well. We know them, one might say, the way that a mother knows her children. And he said, we've come to consider them as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. Right? The slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And I think we're experiencing some of that today. And, we look at our I remember a moment, it was actually before Donald Trump, entered the political scene, but even in 2015 and headed into 2016, so at PRI, which is my kind of day job, I'm the president and founder there, we do public opinion surveys. And I remember sitting at a table 2015, 2016, and we usually are thinking about policy questions that we can ask. Like, what do Americans think about this policy or that policy? And it just became clear that the biggest divides that we were all wrestling with were less about this policy or that policy, and they were so much more about American identity. Right? Who is this country for? Like those kinds of questions. Who is a true American? All right, these were the questions that were kind of pushing us back on our heels and that were really dictating the fault lines. And even the policy questions were proxies for those bigger debates in the country. So I'm going to kind of talk about that. Before I get too far along, just a little bit more about me. So that's my day job. But I'm also someone who grew up very much inside. We've heard a lot about white evangelical Christians in the world. I grew up very much inside that world. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi as a Southern Baptist. Right? My family goes back 6 generations to Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia. My siblings and I are the first ones not to live in 200 years in either Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia. Right, so deep Southern roots, mostly Baptist with a few Methodists thrown in, for variety, but mostly Baptist all the way back. I have in my possession a family Bible from 1815, which was carried from Virginia down to that first family that settled in Georgia in the early part of the 1800s. So this is very, very deep. My bones. I went to public school in Mississippi, but then I went to a Southern Baptist college right outside of Jackson, Mississippi. I have a degree from a Southern Baptist seminary as well. I think I have the claim to fame of being the only person who gets called a pollster in Washington, D.C., who has a seminary degree. Right, so I'm going to try to bring all that to bear. But the thing that is notable is that I think as I've been wrestling with these questions, particularly this entanglement of white supremacy, Christianity, and our current political angst, I've been driven sort of to use the social science, but also more and more to history, right? Because some of the kind of how can this be reactions that I have sometimes looking at these numbers, are answered, I think, more, it becomes less mystifying if we have a clearer vision of our history. Now, we've all had a very front row seat to a big cultural fight over our foundings just in the last few years, right? 1619, right? The 1619 Project. Nationwide kerfuffle over this. Now, why is that, right? That somebody's suggesting that we reframe our origins and think about a different founding than 1776 and think about 1619. Why is that such a big thing, right? And it's because, right, our Genesis stories are never neutral, right? And so this in the beginning, our in the beginnings contain in them the seeds of the positive story we're going to tell about ourselves. Now, I used to collect, postage stamps, and so like when I think of 1776, there's a postage stamp that comes to my mind, and it is of all those white dudes in their colonial finery awkwardly posing around a table with their quill pens, right, in Philadelphia. That's the image that is in my head. So, if you think about that, if that is our origin story, who's in the frame? Right, in that story, and what other things do we have to account for in the rest of our story? Well, it's a pretty straightforward story of virtue and freedom and white people. That's the only story you have to tell if that's who's in the frame at the beginning. But we do think in these images, right? And so I think one of the most powerful things about the 1619 Project wasn't just the date, but if you remember, for any of you who saw the original publication in the New York Times, there was an image that went along with it. Can you dial it up? Does anybody remember the image? If you don't, it was a monochromatic image of a vast ocean. It was dark on the bottom. It was kind of gray sky on the top, like solid horizon line, this dark water below that. And that was the image, right? And so it evokes this transatlantic conquest that happened. And then the story, of course, is about one ship. It's not the Mayflower, right? In 1619, it's about this ship bringing Africans taken against their will over to the early British colony. So if that's what's the initial frame, if that's the initial image, we have to tell a very different story about ourselves. And so, I think that's really important. I'm going to suggest here that we actually need to step back even further. And this is kind of one of the claims I make in the book, is that at 1619, I think it was a huge gift to kind of have us dislodge that little small postage stamp white dudes in Philadelphia image of our beginnings. I mean, that was a huge cultural lift, an important, I think, watershed moment for us in our self-understandings. But if we think about that, by 1619, the European interactions with indigenous people in this country were more than a century old, right? More than a century of interactions by that time. So I'm going to argue that we have to really take it back, and I'm going to argue that we need to take it back to, and there's nothing magic about this date, we could pick other dates, but at least, if we're thinking about the kind of most proximal place to take it back to, at least to 1493, right? Not 2, but 3. And why 3? So, we all learned, I think, some version of Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and kind of an early rhyme in elementary school. But what's important about 1493? So what happens in 1493 is Columbus returns, right? And he returns, and what does he do? He says, well, I want to go back, and I need more. I need more ships. I need more soldiers. I need more missionaries. Like, we all kind of got the concrete piece of this. But the other thing that I think is often missed our radar, and I think I'm going to suggest is very important for us, is he asked for a moral mandate for what he was going to do, right? For the whole colonial enterprise. And who does he turn to get that moral mandate? Well, he turns to the head of the Western Christian Church at the time, right? So this is Europe in 1500. So just kind of make sure we kind of get it all straight. This is before the Protestant Reformation, right? There are no Protestants in the world. It's before the break of the Church of England with the Catholic Church. So everyone in Western Europe is looking to the Pope in Rome as the kind of arbiter of what the official Christian position is on everything. And so what begins to happen, actually, and 1493 was the culmination of about 4 decades of new theology for the new world. Right, and so it presented this dilemma, and the essential question that the kings and queens of Europe were putting to the Pope, and they got developed in this whole series of documents that has come to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery, right? And essentially what happens is they begin to ask this question. Well, okay, there's all these people here that we didn't know were here, on lands that we didn't know were here. What is our moral responsibility toward them? And what human rights do they have that we are bound to respect? And the answer began to be developed in these kind of theological documents and official papal bulls between 1452 and 1493. One of the last ones for the Americas issued really in response to Columbus's voyage. And essentially, there are all kinds of fancy theology. You can read them. There's a website up called the Doctrine of Discovery.org. You can read them in Latin. You can read them in English. But essentially, they boil down to this. The defining moral question about human rights came down to a theological question, and it was this one. Are they Christian? Are they Christian? And if the answer was no, which of course it was, then a whole series of things followed. They were to be considered, and these are the words right out of the documents, enemies of Christ, right? So this kind of bellicose language right off the bat. And as such, Europeans had the authority of the church and the power of the state to go in and to occupy their land, to take their goods, and if they resisted, to use force. And that force could be wielded either as violence and just outright killing, or in the language of the documents, it even calls for them to, and this is a direct quote, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, right? So this is the language coming out of the person that they consider to be the vicar of Christ on earth, right? The Pope, right? The head of the Western Catholic Church, and it applied to all of Western Christendom. So I'm going to suggest that this kind of doctrine of discovery, I've talked about it, it's kind of a Rosetta Stone, really, for understanding the way that the moral compass was set for all of the versions of Christianity that landed on these shores, right? And that we have then inherited as a culture here. It predates the country by hundreds of years, right? It's here that far back. And so I think readjusting our frame and getting clearer about that is like, very, very important. So just unless you think it is so far back there and, okay, that's way back there, I'm going to give you just a couple of ways in which it shows up. And what they ended up saying in these documents was essentially that it was two things that Europeans were giving to these peoples, and that these gifts were so great that any other losses, land, lives, property, were justified by their reception of two things. And the two things were the superiority of European civilization and Christianity. It was that dyad, civilization and Christianity. You see it over and over and over in these documents. And that was seen to be what they were receiving, and anything else they lost was, paled in comparison to that. But this sense, though, and this sets up not only the genocide and removal of indigenous people, but the whole transatlantic slave trade, right, is kind of all bound up in this idea. Are they Christian? If not, all of this other stuff about domination follows. So it's a theological project from the beginning with political power behind it. But it's this idea and this kind of European superiority and Christian civilization over indigenous people and Africans is embedded in our founding documents, and it's embedded in our founding laws. And it complicates, I think, the ways that we sometimes think, if we could just get back to the founding fathers, we're all good, right? But it complicates this. Like, so in the Declaration of Independence, it has principles that we're rightly proud of. But if you look at that, there's a list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And the very last one in that list of grievances against the King of England has these words: he has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Right? That's in the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, that excited domestic insurrections, he's talking about slave rebellions, right, there. So this kind of the complaint against the King of England is not sufficiently suppressing, right, Africans and indigenous people in the country. The Constitution, of course, right in Section 2, excludes explicitly Indians in there, and only counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, famously, and then only for the purpose of increasing their white owners' influence, right? In law, Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, just a few decades after that, Chief Justice John Marshall says this: the character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The palpitants of the Old World found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing upon them civilization and Christianity, right? That's Supreme Court law. This was cited, this idea of the Doctrine of Discovery established there. This one's going to hurt, I'm going to warn you. Was cited as late as 2005 in a majority opinion against the Oneida Nation by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg in footnote 1. So this history, again, kind of complicates it. And in the book, I kind of write about it this way, that it was common even for well-meaning liberals, liberal whites, to talk about solving the so-called Negro problem or the so-called Indian problem, right, that the U.S. had created with these policies. But I think what this analysis reveals, really, and a better way to put it, is that if we push past the so-called Negro problem and the Indian problem, and we push back beyond that, at the headwaters, what we really find this country is a white Christian problem. So if we pull back the aperture and we see this larger frame, and that's one of the things that I think hopefully the bigger contribution I'm trying to make in the book. I do try to tell some stories. I'm not going to get into them here, but I just want to kind of flag it for you that I did go on the ground in Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Minnesota. I know we had some Minnesota folks up here who are reckoning with this legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery and the white racial violence that's emanated from it, and who are working to tell a more inclusive story about their communities and about America itself. And I think if I'm finding hope anywhere, it's what's happening on the ground in local communities, claiming these histories, trying to tell the truth, trying to reckon with it, and to move forward with a new foundation. So along the way, to kind of give you some of the flavor, these stories will connect. Then they connect up the story, or show the connections between Emmett Till in the 1950s. And the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto in the Mississippi Delta, that was 500 years before. Between the lynching of 3 black circus workers in Duluth and the mass execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, and between the murder of 300 African Americans during the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa and the Trail of Tears. And what I'm trying to do there is kind of reframe this story of American origins to explain how the founders of the U.S. could build the philosophical framework for a democratic society on a foundation of mass racial violence. And why this paradox survives today in the form of white Christian nationalism. I mentioned today these measures that Andrew and PRI and others are providing. They do show that this, even though this sounds like very far-fetched, like the Doctrine of Discovery, way back in the 15th century, but when we ask a question, we devised one at PRI to ask about this kind of core idea, and we just asked Americans, do you agree or disagree, right, that America was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians? We just add it straight, that you agree or disagree, that's who this country is. We find that a significant minority of Americans still affirm that today. That was this year. 30% of Americans affirm that idea. Now, that means that 2/3 of the country does not, right? So that's very good news, right? 2/3 of the country rejects this idea, but 30% of the country affirms this. And the reason why, though, that it is so powerful today is because that 30% is not just kind of evenly distributed in all groups around the country. There are 2 groups, essentially, where a majority affirm that idea. Again, that America was designated by God as a promised land for European Christians. Those 2 groups are self-identified Republicans and white evangelical Protestants that are the base of that make up more than 1/3 of self-identified Republicans. And by the way, self-identified Republicans today are 70% white and Christian, right? That's how homogeneous the party has become in a country that is only 42% white and Christian today, right? The Democratic Party is about 1/4 white and Christian. So part of the kind of fierce, visceral fights we're having on partisan grounds is because they're being played out along racial and religious lines, in this country. And increasingly, we have a Republican Party that's embodying this assertion of white Christian nationalism. Again, it's not new, right? It is older than the country itself and kind of stemming, again, from these 15th century doctrines. So in the book, I'm trying to uncover this history and I think to say out loud what often kind of just gets subtly asserted, left just under the surface, and getting clarity about this in a way that can demystify the present. I'm going to read one more, on my kind of way to landing the plane here. I'm going to read one more excerpt from my book, and it's where what I try to do here is, we've all in our states, I think there's only 12 states today that don't, Andrew could correct me here, but I think there's something like only a dozen states that have not had anti-critical race theory bills introduced into their legislatures in one way or the other, trying to ban the teaching of certain kind of history. And again, why now? Because we're at this moment of reckoning, and because those beginnings matter, right, for the present. Those stories we tell, they really matter. So what I did toward the end of the book is I tried to just channel the best I could what I think white Christians are really saying, right, when they are opposing the teaching of African-American history, are trying to ban so-called critical race theory. What are they really saying? And I maybe say, what are we really saying? Folks from my background. So here is my best attempt to try to just put it into words and say the quiet part out loud. Here's what I think it sounds like. We would like to hold these truths to be self-evident, that we bear no responsibility for the actions of our ancestors, nor for the effects of their actions on the present. That hard work and individual merit are the keys to understanding both the path to the present and the possibilities of the future. The haves and the have-nots of today receive what they deserved based on the virtues of their individual past actions. It follows that no one, particularly hardworking white Christian people, should be made to feel uncomfortable because of what we now have. If anyone asserts otherwise, we are the ones being discriminated against. This land is our land, from California to the New York Island. We deserve to keep everything we've worked so hard to take. We have deeds and safe deposit boxes with our names on them, the veracity of which are guaranteed by a notary seal and a state we created for that purpose. As for the vast amount of wealth locked away in individual trusts and individual institutional endowments, we have histories that document our industriousness and our cunning, along with quarterly and annual statements that testify to our now long-held legal ownership. Furthermore, what we have done with the ultimate authority. Jesus is one of us. In case there was any doubt, we made a likeness of Jesus in our image, the most widely distributed portrait in human history. We insist, both for ourselves and for others, on an inevitable present, one in which what was leads to what is, and what is will always be. It is not that we're against history. We know the importance of a good origin story. History, done rightly, explains how we got here, with our fences transforming land into property, our ledgers turning labor and crops into capital, and our hands holding the receipts. The history of America, founded in 1776, is a Genesis story justifying the divinely ordained now, not a sloppy mess of narratives with multiple beginnings and contingent outcomes. Those who look like us own the publishing companies who hired our writers to tell us the story of how we became America. Those executives also had the right connections to sell those packaged narratives to our public schools, who handed books and lesson plans to our teachers, who in turn faithfully taught those stories to our children. And the circle remained unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by. We know that slavery was a blemish on the country's record, and that this was mostly the cause of the Civil War. Still, there were good and noble people fighting on both sides. Even though slavery wasn't always as brutal as Hollywood depicts it, we're glad that sinful practice has ended and that the whole unfortunate episode is behind us now. What we didn't get right after the Civil War was finally rectified by the good Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose eloquent words we now read in our churches and whose birthday we celebrate alongside Robert E. Lee's, which my home state of Mississippi still does to this day. On the occasion when we think about it, we also feel bad about what happened to the Indians. But we also share Laura Ingalls Wilder's sentiments about the land in the early days of the country. Quote, "There were no people there. Only Indians lived there." End quote. In any case, we weren't personally a part of all that. And it was, after all, our missionaries who brought the Indians with their primitive and savage ways out of the darkness and into the light of Christian salvation. It was our government and our churches that coaxed those lost children out of the woods and into boarding schools, saving their souls and disciplining their bodies for more industrious pursuits like farming and factory work. We still honor their history with our athletic team names, mascots, and more recently with the occasional land acknowledgement ritual at public events. We did finally give the Indians reservations of their own, and they seem to be doing fine now with their casinos and government-provided health care and welfare subsidies. Finally, though of course there have been some times when some Christians acted badly, they were acting against and not with the spirit of our faith. No true Christian would kill or steal or lie. This is the story we want our tax dollars to teach public school children, and many of our children are already getting this history in private Christian academies, of course. We want our children to know that America is good, just like us. So, I think at the heart of our democracy is this unresolved question. I think it can actually be boiled down to something fairly simple that is directly rooted in this doctrine of discovery thing we have been wrestling with for 500 years. And the fundamental question before us is this one: are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, or are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone, regardless of race or religion or non-religion, stands on equal footing as citizens? I think it's as simple as that. Now, we've never fully resolved that question in all of our history and even in our prehistory, right? It has been with us, and it's in our laws, it's in our DNA, it's in our culture, right? These competing streams of American identity. We just had some legislators up here. In a legislative session, one of the ways you end a debate that might go on forever is somebody calls for the question, right? And when you call for the question, you have to stop debating and you have to take a vote, right? Assuming that passes. And I think we're at a moment in our history today where the question is being called, right? For us to answer this essential question. The demographic shifts, the tireless efforts of prophets and activists are calling the question. And affirming that latter vision today is really the only way, I say, we are going to live into America's promise and finally find the path to a shared American future. Thank you.